Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Kakalia, and I'll be presenting to you today on Mary Ann Stankiewicz. We'll be going through her upbringing, her education, her career, her philosophy, and also her legacy. So, a bit about her childhood. She was born in King, New Hampshire on May 5th, 1948. This was a really small town. You can see an old photo there from around this time. She lived in a post war house in a working class neighborhood. Her parents were in the working class but moved kind of more into middle class when her father was promoted to manager of the factory that he worked at. Her mom was a stay at home mother and housewife, although she did work before getting married. So Marianne grew up in a very traditional family household. She was an only child, and the family had traditional views on, the father is the breadwinner and the mother stays home. Although they were very traditional like this, they had hopes and dreams that Marianne would go on to college and work before she married, although they did expect her to get married one day. She grew up in this kind of very traditional family values but with the expectation that she would go on to get an education later in her life. She always loved art. Her first recall of making art, she's at the kitchen table drawing, and she remembers drawing as far back as she can remember before kindergarten. And she knows that her parents always, encouraged her to do it and encouraged her to draw, although she was always very self critical and never really felt that her drawings were good enough for her own standards. But when she got to kindergarten, her kindergarten teacher actually noticed that she had some talent and recommended to her mother to purchase Your Child and His Art by Lowenfield. So her mother did, and they put it on the shelf there for her, and Marianne would go and look at it as a child. And she remembers looking through the book, just being amazed at the drawing she saw inside and hoping that one day she would get to draw that well. So I point out Lowenfield because when she gets to college, she actually is reintroduced to Lowenfield again at Syracuse University. So she studied, art throughout her, practiced it throughout her childhood, and then went on to get a BFA in art education when she finished high school. She went to Syracuse University, and in her semesters there, she was assigned to read Creative and Mental Growth by Lowenfield, and she immediately made the connection to Lowenfield from kindergarten and, went home and looked at the book and was amazed that, he was still around. So Lowenfield's ideas were very popular during this time of her upbringing, and then, she's studying it in college. And his ideas were on the progressive side, although they were a little bit more grounded and concrete than maybe some of the other progressive philosophers of education at the time. So his work was done in schools often. So he did a lot of work with psychology, and he came up with some stages of development and what your art should look like in each of those stages. And it was a very helpful guide for teachers teaching art at this time. So being introduced to Lowenfield again made his work more meaningful to Marianne because she was introduced to him in her childhood. But she graduated with her art education degree in 1970 and then went on to teach elementary art education for 4 years. And then after those 4 years, she decided to go back to get her MFA in art education again at Syracuse. But this time, synesthetic education was coming in to popularity. And synesthetic education was about teaching through holistic experiences. It was about sensory learning, and it was about doing things. Lowenfield's ideas were not as relevant anymore, and she got really into synesthetic education, also known as Syn Ed. She remembers having t-shirts made and it being a huge push during her MFA. She also got a job working as a mentor for student teachers during her MFA program. So she also got to see kind of teaching from the other side and mentoring new teachers going into the field. And although she agreed with all the ideas that were being introduced to her during her MFA program at Syracuse, she also kind of felt indoctrinated to them. She agreed with everything that was being taught to her, but she also felt that it was kind of being pushed upon her. So she graduated in 1976 and then moved on to Ohio State, which we'll look at in a second, which had a much more diverse faculty. But also in her MFA degree, she discovered her love of history. And this is important because art education history became one of Marianne's kind of biggest accomplishments. She's done a ton of work in that field, and it was her MFA where she kind of found that love. In her weaving class, her professor asked her to do a report on a textile mill. So she took, photographs and writings and sketches of this mill and learned about it and researched it. And she found out that that process was really interesting to her. And so that's kind of what sparked her passion for history. And then you see her kind of putting those two things together here in her PhD. So she moved on to Ohio State to continue art education studies. She chose Ohio State for a few reasons. The biggest one was that for its diverse faculty, the faculty was known to kind of have disputes with one another over their differing ideas. So she thought that that would kind of be a good change for her. Also, Ohio State at the time, their art education department was ranked in the top 5 of the nation. So a very good school for her to go on to. Discipline-based art education, or DBAE, was also becoming popular at this time. So not only was she getting a diverse, amount of philosophies from the faculty there that she was talking to and the colleagues that she was with, but also, a new kind of movement in art education was coming in. So DBAE was very much about art production, art criticism, art history, and aesthetics. Those 4 kind of key components were thought to be kind of the cornerstones of what you should teach in art education, and it was less about the sensory experiences of Syn Ed and more now about this. So in her first semester at Ohio State, kind of everything she had been learning thus far with Lowenfield's ideas and synesthetic education, it all kind of got turned up on its head, and she felt kind of lost. But as the semesters went on, she made new friends, and with the faculty and other students there, she realized that really she just needed to be critical of all teaching methods. That not one method of teaching or one philosophy is going to be correct. And she graduated in 1979 and immediately got a job working in higher education. So we will now move on to her careers. So she moved on to the University of Maine as a professor. She got her she worked there, as a temporary professor, and then got her tenure there. She worked in the education department. She's worked, from then she moved to Cal State Long Beach, where she was professor and then also department chair of the art education program. She also worked at the Getty Center for Art Education as a program officer and the Ringling School of Art and Design in academic affairs. From there, she moved into independent scholar and consulting. So she kind of just moved around between different school districts and museums. She worked with a huge list of differing things where she kind of mentored different art education programs throughout Sarasota, Florida. And then from there, she moved into one of the bigger parts of her career, which was teaching at Pennsylvania State. And she worked there from 1999 to 2018. She was a professor there in art education, known as professor in charge, and she ended up retiring with emerita status. So she's probably most well known for her time in Penn State. Also, it was most recent that she has been there. Another big part of her career was the National Art Education Association. She worked with NAEA from before she worked at Penn State from 1995 to 2019. When she first got a job there, she was working on editing art education journal that they have. She was working on bringing in diverse perspectives to the journal, and then she stayed with the association doing various jobs and differing things, throughout all those years. She says that 2 of the things she's most proud of in all of her accomplishments of her life, of her career, are actually being a part of this association. She says those 2 things are the fact that she was president in all 4 of its regions at one point, or another, and also that she was able to work for both of their journals, the Art Education Journal and the Studies in Art Education Journal. She says, as far as she knows, she's the only one who's been able to edit and work on both of those journals. So very much involved in NAEA. And then the next big part of her career is obviously her writing on art education history. She's single authored two books, The Root of Arts Education Practice and then Developing Visual Arts and Education in the United States. Both of those books deal with kind of an overview of art education history. Therefore, teachers, in coming into the field, um, working on just gaining a general understanding of art education history. And she comes at it from multiple perspectives, kind of bringing in her critical lens. She's actually currently working on writing another book as well. This one is going to be on post World War II art education in the US. And that's kind of interesting because that is the art education during her lifetime. And it's right now working under the proposed title Practicing Art Education at the End of Art. So we'll have to keep an eye out for when that book is published. But she has written a slew of other things. She's worked on many, many academic journals and edited many, many papers. But these are probably the two, that we can give her all the credit for, as she has single authored both of these books. Next, we'll go into her philosophy of education. She says that determining her exact philosophy is actually the hardest question to answer. In an interview with her, she said people ask her this question and she never quite knows how to pinpoint what to say. She says, though, that she knows she's always critical. And that word came up a lot when talking about her philosophy of education. She just says, that she's just very critical of everything that is put forth towards her, and everything that she encounters, she questions. So I would say her, philosophy of education being influenced by a variety of things as listed here, and that she knows that she's critical is probably more on the progressive side. So she wants to constantly be finding ways for improvement. She wants to constantly be questioning what is going on currently and constantly trying to figure out why things have been and why things are the way they are and how we can make them better for the future. So um, that's where I would say her philosophy of education is. Also, I want to mention here that her philosophy of education is influenced by feminism, which is something I haven't talked about yet. So, we have Lowenfield, her 4 years of teaching elementary art, her time in her master's with synesthetic education, her years of mentoring student teachers, the diverse perspectives she encountered at Ohio State, her introduction to discipline-based art education, her various careers in all the different universities, but something that also reoccurs a lot in her papers is feminism. So that is something that she grew up in a traditional household, although she also grew up, and was kind of coming of age of a time when the feminist movement was very strong. So she looks to a lot of things through the feminist lens as well, and you can see that reflected in her writings. This is something she said during our interview. She says, art education should always be improving for all learners. It should be a part of general education and be available equally to all people of all backgrounds, ages, and learning abilities. So Marianne really, does believe that art education should be for everyone and that everybody should have access to it. So I think we can put that also into her overarching goals for art ed. And lastly, we'll look at her legacy. She says, if I can leave some questions that get people thinking, then that will be a good legacy. So she really just wants people to, just like her, be critical of what you see. She says that she doesn't want anybody to take anything for granted. And just because we've done things a certain way for so long, or because we do things a certain way now, that it has to be that same, we have to do the same thing later. So she wants people to always, question and think about why things were, why things are, and how we can improve it for later. And So she says that she really just hopes that people continue reading the stuff that she's wrote and learn to be critical like herself. So that is Mary Ann Stankiewicz. Here are all of the references that I used to gather all of the information presented to you today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for watching.